which is, at Kickstarter, we've been thinking a lot about how does our role change in this current political climate? Does it change? And also sort of how it's impacted all of us here in the office. And so I'm curious if you could just address, has the current political climate changed what you bring to work every day and your relationship to creativity and the art world in general?
I can kick it off. Well, I remember waking up the day after the election. I actually remember election night because we had worked to deinstall the project, Pedro's project, that day. And I remember texting my whole staff and checking in on them and waking up the next morning feeling like everything that we had planned for 2017 had to be scrapped and we needed to rethink it and start again. And I kind of was in a complete, panic/denial a little bit, and really thinking about, well, working outside of the bubble, the New York bubble. And, as a primarily New York-based organization, were our projects that we were working on still did they still resonate? Were they still as important? And did it matter to do them in New York? Did it make sense to still do them in New York? I, since calmed down. And my staff was, and I realized that, yes, they did, and we still serve a purpose. And, the things that we had worked on, the artists that we were working with, their ideas still resonated, and the issues that they were contending with were not going anywhere. And in fact, we're probably going to become more and more, problematic or more serious. And so we recommitted to those. But it has challenged us to think about how we get out of the New York bubble, what that might look like, and really to think about how we can provide more opportunities for artists, how we can kind of help to amplify their ideas in a way that's not always about a large-scale, big commission.
Do you want to go?
You go first.
Katie, what you're saying about the New York element is something that resonates with me a lot. I know for our team, as an organization that's national, we obviously have an office in New York and then also an office in New Orleans. There was this real feeling of okay, here in New York, we have real privilege because we can speak automatically and assume that everybody who we're running into is sort of having the same experience. But what about all the artists that we work with nationally? So something that for me personally really came forward immediately was freedom of expression being something that for the last 8 years I sort of took for granted, and recognizing that instantaneously that felt threatened in a way for the artists that we see nationally, and starting to think as a funder about what does that mean for us. And so some of what we're starting to think about is obviously it's still in some ways too soon to know exactly how things are going to unfold, but what are the networks and what are the partnerships we can create. So we just had a board meeting on Friday, and one of the things that we were looking at the board meeting was literally what mapping our networks, and starting to talk through what are the networks we need to talk to more clearly, which are the ones we've sort of informally started to talk to. How can we, as an organization that has funded over 1,000 artists nationally, has worked with lots of artists, how can we sort of pull artists up into this dialogue, and also make sure that major funders like the Ford Foundation are getting pulled down into it? What's our potential in that space?
Can you cite some specific examples of maybe new partners that you're looking at?
Well, it ranges, because frankly this is early, but what it ranges is I feel like it's our obligation as an Artist Endowed Foundation to talk to other Artist Endowed Foundations, to talk about literally, is there a public stance that we're taking as Artist Endowed Foundations at this time? Who knows whether everybody's going to agree to partner with me.
Right.
But that sort of thing where it's just saying, look, there's a group of us, and there's a growing group of us that are funders very specifically coming from artists. So we have an obligation to step forward right now and talk about what we stand for right now. So that would be an example of something like that.
I think an example from the context in which White Columns operates in New York is about, in the UK, several years ago now, a group formed of not-for-profit art spaces who were threatened with government cuts. And in the UK, these organizations were typically receiving 50% of their funding from government sources. And these spaces understood there was a real threat to their funding being withdrawn. So they formed a group called Common Practice. And it was a group of very intelligent, quite different organizations who came together to create a critical mass around the issues that faced them at that time. So around 4 years ago in New York, White Columns and 7 other organizations, it's now 17 organizations, created a parallel group called Common Practice New York. And 4 years ago, the issues we faced included, the complexities of real estate, the way that the city is becoming unaffordable for artists and organizations that support artists. And we aligned with, say, a group like Wage that looks about how artists are remunerated when they present their work in publicly funded spaces and so on. But more recently, Common Practice supported a project called Decolonize This Place, which took place at Artist Space, but had far wider reach and included a far wider group of voices. And the recent change in the administration, I think, just makes all of these conversations more critical and more urgent. And then more specifically to White Columns, I think White Columns, for the most part, I think we're interested in artists' ideas where consensus is yet to exist, or where consensus is yet to form. So oftentimes we're showing work for the first time, and our audience is seeing it for the first time or close to the first time. And consequently, the audience for that is actually quite small. It's quite a focused audience, and it's the same, I think, in experimental music, experimental poetry, or theater, and so on. There isn't a large audience for unknown and untested work. By the time that work moves forward through the culture and might eventually arrive at the New Museum or eventually at the Whitney Museum, etc., the audience for those ideas has grown larger. But for the most part, we're dealing with quite a sort of focused audience who are interested in new things or untested ideas, as are our peers at the kitchen and participant and so on. And consequently, I think the current circumstances we work in, I think, just sort of underscore the importance of supporting voices that perhaps don't yet have a platform here, who the New York audiences in their overlapping nature haven't yet had an opportunity to encounter or think about. And certainly I think the work we've done in the last decade in collaboration with centers nationally and internationally that support artists with mental and developmental disabilities, for me at least, seems to be the most critical work we're doing alongside the other kind of work we're doing. So we'll continue to do that. I do think the current political horizons look very pessimistic, and it's quite gloomy landscape to be working in, because I don't think we relate to the government that we currently exist. So we'll have to work around that, as I'm sure my predecessors did in the 1970s and 1980s, when there were other quite pessimistic times. But I think a lot remains unknown.
Does your activism in that space sort of remain on the art side of protecting the opportunity for artists and creative people to make work, or is there some responsibility to extend beyond that, or to build bridges to other political issues that might be of value or of importance?
Well, I think we have, certainly as the director of the organization, I feel a kind of responsibility to, be able to switch the lights on and open the door, because I think the work that precedes me and the work that unfolded at White Columns is now historical, and a lot of it helps shift or shape or form, the culture that we currently have. So it seems to me that we have a responsibility to continue with that. I think what became apparent to myself and some of my peers that are now members of the Common Practice Group, which, as I mentioned, is now 17 organizations, but hopefully will continue to grow organically, is that on ourselves, it was increasingly difficult to create a larger narrative because the day-to-day concerns of trying to run a not-for-profit space in a for-profit city can often be overwhelming. But I think we found cumulatively that we can have a greater narrative a greater impact than a larger conversation. And I think also, to speak to your point, I think it also forces common practice as a kind of group or collective identity to start to establish whether we can actually have a coherent ideological, political position, or whether that's actually not appropriate for 17 different organizations that ultimately have 17 quite idiosyncratic missions.
And for me, I guess the main concern that has come up, which I'm very lucky, is that I've always learned so much from all the artists that I work with. Like, I often tell people they have much more education than I do, and they all, they've all been, some of them have been to wonderful grad schools, and they really do, and they teach, a number of them teach at wonderful schools too. So they bring me a lot of information and will talk to me about what's important to them. There's been a number of sort of organized closing days that have happened in the art world, like the J21? Yeah, strike, J20. And like Carolyn and I went down to DC for, the Women's March, and there was a strike again last week. And so I try to listen and observe with, to what they feel strongly about. But I think the main concern for the gallery and its artists and sort of the viewing public of the gallery is that, that we really need to rally, because even though the stock market's up and the Dow's up and everything, people are feeling really insecure. And so even our sort of regular patrons, we always, the art world's gotten so big that we depend on a lot of people becoming interested all the time and sort of keeping up the energy and people feeling confident about being interested in art, and then subsequently hopefully purchasing it so that artists can continue to operate their studios and hopefully make a living. So the biggest concern of the gallery has been really just to try to stay the course, stay exciting, and stay relevant, and help people to continue to believe that art is a viable thing to spend time with and to invest in. Because I think that's what we're in danger of seeing, is just a lack of interest, because people are so confused, about, because realizing that you're living in a bubble with your interests can be very destabilizing. And I think for everybody, for artists, for gallery owners, for foundation runners, we all feel a little uneasy. So I think it's just it's a time for staying positive and keeping people interested, and finding ways to keep staying relevant.
So we talked about this a little bit prior, but from my experience at the art fairs a couple weeks ago, that the work was not predominantly political. And for me, I see a big line between what's commercial and what's maybe activist art, and what we might all feel. So I sort of have a two-part question to think about. Does it affect who? Artadia is a grant maker, but we also fundraise all the time. We partner with different foundations and corporations and individuals in our 7 cities. So it's made me think about who are our partners, what's right for us, how do we keep the integrity of what we do, keeping that in mind. Maybe the same question, not putting you on the spot, but who you sell the work to. But how do we think it's important to make that line between activist art and activist gestures and commercial work, and how we situate what we do in that world? So that's a tough question, but are you guys thinking about that? Is that important, do you think?
I think that it's such a small world that I really do believe in the interconnectivity of everybody. I mean, everybody's jobs include conflicts. And having a commercial art gallery, it's like comes with the territory. So does it need to remain? No, I don't think so. I think, I like to think that, nobody will tell you to open an art gallery if you want to make, money. I do believe in the importance of commercial galleries for the viewing public at large, and that activism can happen in the gallery, but there's all different kinds of activism. Like you were saying earlier, just doing something creative with your life and devoting yourself to that is a type of sort of radicalism. Yeah.
I guess I think if the NEA goes away, at least Artadia's mission, how I feel is that it couldn't be more important. We're going to be filling a real gap. All of us will be filling a real gap.